Okay, go ahead and turn over to Genesis chapter 15. We're going to continue our study about Abraham. Well, still Abram, not Abraham yet. We're getting close. We're just a couple chapters away from that change. So I'm going to do my best to keep it to Abram while we're still here. Last week we got through most of chapter 15. I just ran out of time. Go figure. It happens all the time, it seems. So last week we had picked up, we had done a portion of chapter 15 the week before, but we started in verse 7, where God, again, he's kind of reminding Abram that, he's got this promise, he's going to be with him, that, he's going to have a great nation come from him. We kind of talked about, what's going on here just a little bit, but we didn't cover it fully. Abram kind of asked, how he knows this guarantee is going to happen, how he knows this promise is going to be. And God instructs him to take all these animals that Abram then cuts in two, except for the birds. And then he lays them out and he has to chase these birds of prey away that try to come down on these carcasses. And then he falls into kind of a deep sleep, is how most translations kind of translate that. And God begins to tell Abram of what is to come. He's actually given pretty detailed prophecy. And I went into a lot of that detail. I won't go again. But he's basically talking about the time of his descendants being in slavery in Egypt. They'll be there for 400 years, he says. He talks about the number of generations, and by using the lineage of the tribe of Judah, we can actually trace out the 4 generations that come out after Egypt into the promised land. So all those things do come true. We see them come true in the books following Genesis as we go from Exodus into what would be eventually Joshua. So we did that last week as well. And then we talked, I think with the last part we talked about was the God talking about how the sin or the wickedness of the Amorites had not been filled yet, which is an interesting comment for him to say, because remember, Abram is allied with some Amorites at this time. The men of Mamre and his brothers were Amorites. We are told that. They seem to be decent fellows. They get along with Abram. They help Abram in the pursuit of the 4-king coalition, which, helps Lot. We don't know exactly how big their assistance was, but they did get a share of some kind. So they were certainly instrumental somewhere in there. Just not a lot of detail. But certainly by the time the Israelites, the children of Israel, go into the promised land, it's a very different story. They seem to have totally gone into the realm of idol worship and of wickedness. And we know this not because of necessarily how they're described, even though we do see that there's a lot of fighting between the Amorites and the Israelites. But we see described in 1 Kings chapter 21 of King Ahab, and then 2 Kings chapter 21 of King Manasseh, how they are compared to the Amorites, and it talks about the things that they did. And it says they were even worse than the Amorites. And these are like the 2 worst kings of the northern and southern kingdom you could possibly imagine, is Ahab of Israel and Manasseh of Judah. They were both some of the worst. If you wanted to make a tier list of some kind, they would rank toward the bottom. But it talks about how they did the things that the Amorites did, and it makes that comparison. So we're able to kind of infer this is what the Amorites were doing by the time the Israelites came into the promised land. So that comes true as well. And that's pretty much where we stopped. So I wanted to kind of get back and finish this last portion of the chapter because it's important stuff that I don't want to leave out. So let's have someone just read that last few verses of the chapter for us, and then we'll talk about them. Even though we read them last week, I wanted to kind of be back in mind here. Someone read verses 17 through the end of the chapter, through I think that's 21. Okay, so we have a lot of stuff I needed to catch back up on that we didn't get to last week, like I said. So kind of going back to the imagery in the earlier verses where it talks about how Abram had cut these animals into 2 and had laid them out. We're kind of going back to that because we didn't really talk about that very specifically. So in verse 17, we have darkness falling. We have an image of, and your translations will vary. Some will say fire pot, some will say oven. And then you have like a blazing torch or a burning torch. And it passes through the two piles of the pieces of the animals. And then it says, to kind of help with the context, I think, in verse 18, that we're told that on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram that his descendants would be given the land from the Wadi of Egypt to the river Euphrates. And we're going to talk about that phrase in a little bit. I want to talk about first the symbolism of passing through these pieces. There's kind of an interesting dynamic going on here, and there's sort of a couple parts to it. That's not a pun or anything. That just happened to come out of my mouth. So one of the things that we got to think about is when, I guess I'll talk about the symbolism itself. Passing through these pieces, it seems to, and I don't really understand it that well, so if maybe someone else knows it better, it seems to indicate that the one who passes through on this promise is kind of saying, let me be like these animals if this does not come to pass, or if my promise fails, or if I don't fulfill what I've promised, let me be like these animals. I'm passing through it. And God himself seems to be the one passing through it with this blazing imagery here. And one of the other things that's really interesting is when someone makes a promise or swears by something. We're going to go to Hebrews in just a second. Maybe some of you know where I'm going. You swear on something that's greater than yourself. So who does God swear by? Let's go to Hebrews chapter 6. Some of you probably know this verse pretty well. Someone read Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 through 16. I think that's the right place. Yes, Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 through 16, please. Okay, so that's a very powerful statement. That's the end of the matter. God is, by doing this, God is saying, I'm going to make this happen. And Abram's asked, how am I going to know? What's my sign? What's my guarantee here? This is it right here. God is swearing by himself, this is going to happen. Let me be like these animals if it doesn't happen. So God he is guaranteeing this is going to pass. Now, again, Abram doesn't really understand how this is going to happen yet. We're going to see in the next chapter how they're going to hit some issues along the way. But Abram is going to be like, okay, this is going to happen. He just doesn't know how quite yet. So it's a really interesting thing that God is doing here. And of course, we're going to see the fulfillment of this in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 21. And we're going to kind of get into this this boundary that God talks about from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt. So I'm going to go to 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 21, and just read that one verse, please.
So Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines. As far as the border of Egypt, they brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life.
Okay, so this isn't the greatest map. I wish I'd found a better one to put up. But it talks about Solomon's domain. Now, Solomon had the largest, as far as we can tell, the largest and greatest borders of the United Kingdom were in his time. So it talks about how from, you have the Euphrates up in the north, this river right here. This is the Euphrates. From here, all the way down to the borders of Egypt. And it's actually going to be right here-ish, just near Beersheba there. That's the domain. That's the height of Israel. That is when, from what I understand, is the fulfillment of this promise. Now, some people are going to argue this very differently, and I want you to be aware of it because there are other interpretations of this. Some do not see it as a north-south border, or if they do, they'd say, well, it should go all the way to the Nile. Well, there is it's not marked on this map, which is why I wish I had known that. There is a river right here on the southern border that is where the southern part of that domain went. So talking about that, not the Nile, I think is what they're talking about. The border of Egypt, the Wadi of Egypt, the division between Egypt and the countries farther north. So it is this division right here. Now, the northern sector was not totally occupied by the Israelites. You had, Solomon had his alliances with the kingdoms up here. You had like Sidon and Tyre that were up in that region. That's how he had control over it. Because he had those political alliances, he had political power over them in that time. It's not that the Israelites were going way up here and then settling in that land, and that's not exactly how it was working. So some people will say, well, that wasn't a full fulfillment. I think that is the fulfillment. He had control between these two rivers, north and south. Some people do not interpret it as a north-south boundary. They interpret it as an east-west boundary. So they'll look at the Nile right here and say, well, we should go all the way here, pretty much to the land of Ur, and it should be this entire region is the promised land. Now, Israel never gets anywhere close to taking all that land. Most of it is just wasteland. It's just desert between here anyways. You really wouldn't want it too much, but that would be like taking all of modern Israel, Gaza, West Bank, Jordan, Syria, parts of Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. That would be that whole area. That is just a huge area. And nowhere do we see God encouraging them to settle that direction. In fact, when you look at the book of Joshua, it talks about the boundaries of the tribes. And it's very specific to the region here. It never talks about anything over here. So that interpretation doesn't really make sense. Otherwise, God would be saying, well, you guys got to keep going east. You got to keep settling east, but that never happens. He never gives that command. So I think that's a misinterpretation. You will see people say that, well, God didn't fulfill his promise here because look at all that space they didn't inherit. I don't think that's the way it's supposed to be interpreted. That doesn't seem to make sense. And contextually, that doesn't make sense based off of the rest of the scripture that we see later. Otherwise, again, when you get to the book of Joshua, why is God not telling them, keep going east, keep going east? You got to keep going and taking that land. He never does that. So I think that interpretation doesn't make sense, but I guarantee you're going to see it. So if you study that at all, it's going to come up. Just be aware of that. I think that's about all I have to say about that. I think that's about all I have to say about chapter 15. I'm not going to go into all the Canaanite tribes. I've done that before in Genesis, when we did our Genesis 10 study. I think we pretty well know most of them. If you want me to go back another time, I will, but I don't feel the need to do that. I want to kind of move on and get into chapter 16 because I've spent a lot of time on chapter 15, more than I expected to. So any other comments on chapter 15 before we move on to the next chapter? Go ahead. Yeah.
To your last statement, there's a passage in Joshua, I can't remember exactly what chapter and verse, where the statement is made that God fulfilled all that and gave them all the land he promised to give them.
Yeah. In fact, there's another argument that I could put in here that makes the east-west boundary not work out, is just on the east side of the promised land, you have Ammon, you have Moab, you have Edom. Now, that may not mean anything to you. It's like, well, they could just take them out too, except that God specifically tells the Israelites not to go into their land because that is promised for them. Lot's descendants have their kind of own thing that God does for them. Esau's descendants have their own promise for them. They have their own thing going on that God says, you're not taking that away from them. So never any point, I mean, you'll see them absolutely dominate militarily and, they'll kind of beat them off, but they're not going in and occupying their land and taking it from them and saying, this is ours now, you don't get this anymore, with those three specific nations, because God had a separate promise for each of them. So if you said, well, the promise should be from the Nile to the Euphrates, east-west, that goes against what God has said in other places. So I think maybe that might be a stronger argument than what I said before. So we got to consider all of what God has said, not just say, oh, he says this from there, and that must be it, and not consider what the other things God has said that would maybe better contextualize how we interpret that. Very good. Any other comments on chapter 15? Okay, all right. We're going to get into the next chapter here. I'm sorry if chapter 15 took a long time. I think it was good, important things. I just wanted to not gloss over them too much. But I do want to move on. Let's go into chapter 16. Someone read for us verses 1 through 6 of chapter 16, please.
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, see now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. But gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Then Sarai said to Abram, "My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me." So Abram said to Sarai, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please." And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence.
Okay, so we're kind of moving on here into another part of Abram's life. This is a kind of really important junction here and some events that happen later on. Now, just as a timestamp here, we're told at the end of this chapter that Abram is 86. So when we start this chapter, he's probably about 85. That would be my guess. You'll kind of figure out how I gauge that. It's going to be pretty obvious. But he's about 85 years old this time. And we know that Sarah is 10 years younger than Abram, so that makes her 75 when this chapter begins. So up to this point, really the focus of Abram having descendants has been about his own old age here. But this is obviously Sarah is getting older with him at the same time, but now her old age is really coming into focus here. More prominently. We're told as early as Genesis 11, verse 30, that she's not able to conceive children. So this is not new information, but a lot of time has passed since then, and it's still, there's nothing. She's not able to conceive here. Abram's been given this promise by God. He's been given this guarantee. We just kind of talked about it a little bit as we were finishing chapter 15, but nothing's happening. And I kind of, I have to be careful about how I say this. I guess the easiest way to think about it is that if through natural means, if we were going by that, what God has promised is going to be kind of impossible through Sarah at this point. 75, she's probably not going to be able to bear children. We know that they were still living a little bit longer than we do today. If you look at the genealogies and stuff, they were still living longer. But not that much longer. We're not talking about like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. We're talking maybe around 100, maybe a little more than that was typically the lifespan of some of these people. So she's definitely old. She's kind of past the age of childbearing. It seems to all the people of that time. So when we say this is something that's naturally impossible, it kind of leads to a couple things. I mean, we can go back to statements like Jesus says in Matthew 19, verse 26, or Mark chapter 10, verse 27, where he says, with man this is impossible, but through God all things are possible. Certainly that is the case. But if you think about it, nothing like what's going to happen later has ever happened, as far as I understand. We will see things like this happen later on in history that we have recorded anyway, but we haven't seen this yet happen in the Bible where someone of great age or inability to conceive suddenly does. So it's something that would be certainly unique at this point. I don't know, it's hard to kind of figure out God's timetable because everything he does is for a reason. So like sometimes I try to pick out, why is God making them wait so long? Is this a test of faith to see, if they're patient enough? Or is this God trying to show something truly miraculous by waiting until they are very old in order to have children? I don't really know for sure, but it's definitely interesting to think about. Now, according to this verse, it's Sarai herself. It's not Abram who suggests this, it's Sarai who suggests that Abram should take her slave Hagar and have children by her. And Abram agrees to do this. Now, I'm going to go on a little sidebar real quick. Nowhere in the Bible is this ever a good idea. I cannot point to any specific example where you have multiple wives and concubines involved, even with righteous men, where this turns out to be like a really great idea. Now, God will certainly work with this, and God does things with these situations, but there's always a lot of suffering and pain that goes along with it. You can have the wives and concubines fighting amongst themselves. Just look at the wives of Jacob, who would become Israel. The children, maybe, of the different wives, maybe fighting with each other. Just look at the descendants of David, of his multiple wives. They literally were killing each other. There was rape between them. There was terrible things going on in that household. And then, you have the multiple wives and concubines of their multiple desires coming and taking a man's heart away from God. Just look at Solomon's wives and concubines. So I can't point to an instance where that was like a really great situation. Again, God will work with those situations. He will bring things about through them. But there are people who will point to this and say, well, the Bible allows us to have multiple wives. Why can't we do this? First of all, it's never said that, hey, this is a great idea. There's never a good example of it. Later in the New Testament, we're told not to do that very specifically, that this was not God's plan. Never anywhere do we see this work out. Now, this is not the first time that this happened in history. Earlier in Genesis, we see Lamech had multiple wives, but we don't really get a lot of detail about that. We get detail about it, it's never good. So, husbands, wives, just think about that, I guess. Maybe that's not an issue within our crowd here in this building, but in the world, that is certainly an idea that is becoming a lot more pervasive. So, just be very careful about that. Now, I want to go back here to talk about this promise to Abram. Now, we're told that Abram's going to have all these descendants. So, what is Sarai in a rush for? We have this promise. But if you go back, especially if you look at Genesis 15, verse 4, it talks, God's promise to Abram is, it is going to be someone of your flesh and blood, Abram. It doesn't actually say anything about Sarai up to this point. Now, if we skip ahead to Genesis 17, God will specifically tell them the promise is going to be by a child from Sarai. We're not there yet, though. So it's interesting to think about what Sarai really had in mind. Was it something she was impatient about? Or was it something that maybe she thought she wasn't part of the promise anymore and was trying to help Abram? Either way, they're doing something that God did not tell them to do. So there's not really a great excuse here for what they're doing, but you could say they had good intentions, maybe. But again, this was not something God instructed them to do. Go ahead.
You could say that what they did was not wrong because not only did they have good intentions, God had not specified. So they didn't know, and they didn't have a written law.
Yeah.
Nadab and Abihu offered strange fire, but they had a law, and they had instructions from where to get the fire, and they got it from somewhere else. And so, when God hasn't instructed, and this is true in the New Testament, then we have liberty. We have a way to take different means. God said go, we can go in different ways. But when the Bible specifies, that's different. But they didn't have a Bible.
Yeah, and that's why.
This is totally understandable, and that's why Sarah received, nor Abraham, no condemnation.
Yeah, and that's why I'm not so hard on Sarah about this, because she was not part of that promise until the next chapter. That's when God specifically says Sarai is going to be the mother of the child of promise. Again, the promise has been to Abram, not yet to Sarah at this point, like you're saying. So
I'll mention that this was a common practice. There was so much emphasis at this time in all of humanity to multiply and fill the earth. This was the prime command that God gave Adam and Eve. After Noah came from the ark, the same kind of command. And it seems to have been handed down very strongly to have as many children as you can. And to be barren is the opposite of that. And what is people, women felt in that time at least that they didn't have a purpose if they couldn't have children.
yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. I do have some notes on that.
It became a common practice. If a wife was barren, then if she had a handmaid, that handmaid would become, for lack of a better phrase, a second-class wife to her husband. The children then would become the first wife's children in a sense, and they would be considered the first to inherit.
And this, we do see this practice again with Jacob's wives later on. This is something that they do. So again, not an uncommon thing. And there's a practical reason to do this. If you wanted to have a strong nation, well, you had to create that nation. It's not, because we think of nationhood much differently now these days. We think of political borders, boundaries, and there happens to be a population within that. At this time, it's whoever your family is. So if you want a powerful nation, you have to have a big family. If you want big armies, that army has to be born. And this is very different thinking probably than what we do today. at least maybe in this country. But there are some countries where the birth rate is such a concern that there are now incentives to, hey, have children as much as possible because we need to keep up our economy. We need them to, strengthen our militaries. This is probably going to be a bigger deal as my lifetime goes on. If you look at areas of Eastern Europe and certain parts of Asia where the population is very old and not a lot of people are being born, there's concern that this country is going to collapse because there's nothing to keep it sustainable. And in this time, in ancient times, if your nation was not sustainable, it got wiped out. It's kind of it's not an easy thing. There's no international order or there's no Hague. There's no one to protect you. You have to protect yourself. So there's certainly a matter of practicality here. So if you wanted to be a great nation, you had to have that great nation born. So having a lot of kids was considered a great honor. We're going to talk about that again in just a second. But I certainly think that there are good points here. Again, not super hard on Sarah because she's not told whether she's not part of the promise or not. But certainly this was not something they were instructed to do. This is an idea that she came up with, and Abram agreed, which I'm not sure what his thought process was there. Maybe he thought the same thing, but I don't know for sure. We're not really told. Now, this section of verses, this is the first time we have Hagar mentioned. I want to bring this up a little bit. Now, we don't really know much about her, really, except for the fact that she was a slave or a servant, depending on translation. Probably slave is probably a better translation. But she was a slave to Sarai. She was serving Sarai. And she was an Egyptian. That's pretty much all we know. Now, it's possible that she is one of the ones that is acquired by Abram when he's in Egypt, back in Genesis chapter 12. Remember, he's in Egypt, and his wife is getting treated by the Pharaoh, and he's going to take her, and Abram gets all these gifts. And one of the things included there is the gift of manservants and female servants, or slaves, depending on your translation again. So it's possible that's where she came from, is while they were in Egypt in chapter 12, she was one of the ones that was acquired. We don't know that for sure. I think that's probably the best guess. That makes the most sense. It's kind of like when we were talking about the servant back in chapter 15 and where he came from, probably from when Abram was up in Haran. It just makes more sense geographically, although there are oral traditions that say it was sooner than that, but that would make the most sense because of geography. But we don't really know much about her aside from that. So whether she became part of the party in chapter 12 or later or earlier, we don't really know. But chapter 12 would be my guess if I had to make a guess.
Did you mention Egypt?
Yep.
Okay. I thought you might.
I did mention Egypt, right? Okay.
You mentioned Haran. I didn't catch the Egypt coming.
Well, how old was Sarai and Abraham at that point? Because, I'm going, and and we're not going to come up with an answer, right?
In this chapter or when they were in Egypt?
They were in Egypt, and she was going to get taken, and he says, no, she's my sister, whatever. She probably wasn't 70, but, so it's a while back, so if Hagar was taken then, she would have been a little child if she's...
Well, she could have been older.
What?
Hagar could have been older. We don't know her age for sure.
No, I know,
Yeah.
but if you're going another 15, 20 years, Hagar herself would be Sarah's age. You know what I mean? So what I'm saying
Well, in chapter 12, at the beginning of chapter 12, we know that when Abram gets to Canaan area, he is 75 years old, which would make Sarai 65. So about 10 years have passed between chapter 12 when they would have, somewhere in there when they would have met Hagar. Although the part where they go down to Egypt is probably a little bit later. We don't have a timestamp for that. But it's probably at least 10 years difference. We don't know for sure how old Hagar was when she joined Abram and his people. Yeah, we don't know for sure. Again, we don't get a lot of information about Hagar. This is probably actually this chapter and a couple other verses, and we're not really going to see much of her after that. I mean, we'll get a lot about Ishmael and some of the actions that she does, but we don't really learn more about her and her past. But we know that she's Egyptian, and we know that she was in service to Sarah, and that's about it. So anything more than that, we kind of have to guess. And I don't like to guess too much, although sometimes it's interesting to think about. So we're not sure. We're not sure how old she was or how that all worked out. Getting back to chapter 16, we do see that Hagar does conceive a child with Abram. And when Hagar discovers she's pregnant with Abram's child, she begins to, some of your translations will vary. Some say she will despise her mistress or have contempt for Sarai. In other words, she's looking very much down at Sarah at this point. Now, Jeff brought this up a little bit earlier, and I'm going to get back to it. The ability to conceive and bear children for women was considered kind of like the primary directive. Like, this is your job. You need to make sure that we have, this is how we build nations, is by having children born. And it was also considered a great honor. If you were able to bear many, many children, this was considered, you were a great wife because you're able to build the nation. You're able to add more people. In fact, even now in Russia, I believe, they are giving out cash incentives to women who can bear, I think it's like 8 children or more. They get paid from the government because Russia is one of those countries that's having an issue with population, just kind of declining. So if you could have so many children, the government will incentivize you for it. You're going to see probably a lot more of that in the coming years. But this was something that back in those times, again, a great honor. And if you were not able to bear a child, well, there could be different thoughts on it. Maybe you're a bad wife, or maybe you had done something wrong, so God was punishing you for something. We did see this a little bit. I want to say it was with Abimelech when Abram is passing through Abimelech's territory, and it says that the women could not conceive during the time when Abimelech was trying to take Sarah. I think that's what it was. It was something like that, the wording of that. So there were times where God did intervene directly upon that. So there was certainly a lot of thoughts of that. And, of course, the greater number of children, the greater the honor. Again, going back to Jacob's wives, who are a very easy example to look at in Genesis chapter 29 and chapter 30. They are basically jockeying for favor with Jacob by trying to have as many children as possible. Leah has children, Rachel has none, so Rachel gives her maidservant, and that maidservant has children, and then Leah says that, I'm not having children now, let me give you my maidservant, and then he gets children by them, and it's all over the place. I don't want to say it's a mess, but it kind of is. But that was what was going on. And so with Sarah having no children and Hagar conceiving what may be the child of promise here, Hagar is sort of pushing up her station. She's pushing up in power and saying, I am greater than you, even though she's Sarai's slave. She's greater now because she's bearing Abram's child. She's bearing the child of promise, perhaps, in this case. We haven't been told otherwise yet by God at this point. So there's certainly a power struggle now going on in this household. Go ahead, Arnold. Mm-hmm.
And you see they did it. So, it's a recurring event.
And it's weird to see it, especially among David and Solomon, consider like these are righteous kings, and this is the thing they're doing. And we do see where that becomes their downfall very much. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but King David, he has a really bad time after his sin with Bathsheba. I mean, her child dies, and then later one of her other children becomes Solomon and becomes the heir. But all the other kids that are in the household, they're still fighting for that power. You have, I won't get into that. That's a whole other study. But there's a whole lot of bad stuff that's happening. And Solomon, too, we see is really tragic how he kind of moves away from God, and he knows it. But he's built all these political ties with all these marriages, which has increased the nation's power, but really has done a number on him. And it's kind of sad to see, which I think is maybe why he wrote a bunch of advice down, because he was living these things, especially in Ecclesiastes, where he's doing all these things and he finds out they're not really that great. They're not worth striving for. And there's only one thing that is worth striving for, and that's service to God. It's great advice. It's a great story. It's just sad how he had to come to that conclusion, how he had to go through it. But yeah, so we see that this does not die out after this one instance. It keeps being an issue as we go on. So Sarai kind of lashes out here, and she lashes out against Abram in verse 5, kind of giving him the blame, like, this is your fault that this is going on. And I'm a husband. I could see Abram's position here and say, like, what are you talking about? You suggested this. This was your idea. What did you want to happen? This should have been what Sarai meant to happen, is that Hagar was going to conceive a child on her behalf. So why is Sarai mad? Well, she's mad because Hagar now has this great honor. She's higher up in the station. She's looking down on Sarai. And Abraham seems to not really want to do anything with this. He's like, whatever, it's not my problem. Deal with it the way you want to deal with it. And Sarai does, and it says she mistreats her or she abuses her. Your translations may vary a little bit. And we don't know what exactly that entailed. We're not given any details. Was it physical or emotional abuse or both? But it was enough that Hagar decides to leave. Now, people are not going to typically leave a situation like that unless things are really bad. The way I think about it now, if you look at the immigration issue that's coming up from the south, the southern border, those people are leaving really terrible situations. You have gang wars, you have the cartels, violence, people are just being killed outright for no reason. They're going to leave a really bad situation. They wouldn't leave it if that wasn't going on. They're leaving because it's that bad. And again, we don't know exactly what was happening here between Sarai and Hagar, but it was enough that she, as someone who is bearing Abram's potential child of promise, and when you're pregnant, you don't really want to do too many physical things like fleeing on foot on your own into the wilderness, but she does, which is, it makes you wonder what Sarah was doing. It was certainly something terrible. But again, we're not given any details about it, so I try not to think too hard about it, because we can just guess at that point and not really know. And I don't think it's really constructive at that point. It was just bad enough that Hagar decided to leave. And that gets us through most of through verse 6. We're kind of at a point where it's a good stopping point. I don't really want to keep going here because I got more to talk about on the second half of this chapter. But we're going to talk about a little bit next week. I'll just kind of tell you what we're going to talk about next week. About Ishmael a little bit, because he's going to be a topic of importance, not so much as how he interacts with Isaac and Isaac's descendants, because there's going to be kind of a parting, but there's going to be some really interesting comparisons between the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael that I do want to take some time to get into, because the details of that really occur after the death of Abraham, but I don't want to leave it out. So we're going to talk a little bit about Ishmael next week and kind of how that works out. So we'll finish chapter 16 next week. We'll get into chapter 17 next week. Chapter 17 is a little bit longer, has some other interesting details that we'll have to talk about. We're going to see some time jumps going on between chapters. We'll talk about that when we get there. So we'll finish chapter 16 next week and get into chapter 17. And we'll stop there. So thank you for your time.